Hi, I'm the Brewmaster. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. Magic the Gathering is a game built on deck building. The asymmetry of the different colors and archetypes and the way that these all come together to make a balanced gameplay experience on the table is what makes Magic so cool. But that deck building experience can be a little bit tricky. Now, whether you were building a 40 card deck for Limited, or a 60 card deck for Constructed, or a 100 card deck for Commander, the last step in all of those deck construction activities is getting your deck down to that deck building limit. And while there is some flexibility in the 40 and 60 card formats, ultimately you do want to make those cuts and get it as close to that number as possible. And in Commander, it has to be exact. So let's talk about some strategies that we can employ to make those last few cuts, to make our deck fit in the box. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table. And whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a maple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So I mentioned in the intro that if you are building a 40 card limited deck or a 60 card constructed deck, you don't have to meet those requirements exactly. You can have a few more cards in your deck or a lot more cards in your deck. So the question is, why wouldn't you? And ultimately it comes down to consistency. If you can run a deck with only 10 cards in it, but those 10 cards win you the game every time, you do that. There's no reason to add additional fluff. The deck limits are a minimum requirement, and you want to have a deck that works as consistently as possible while still being at that point. So when we build a 40 card deck or a 60 card deck, generally we do want to build a 40 card deck or a 60 card deck, unless we have a very good reason for including extra cards. For a while, Yorion required you to have 20 extra cards in your deck, and it was often worth it to do that, which is why the card got banned a bunch. But now, if we're building this limited deck, we'll start the conversation here. So now, when we are building our limited deck, typically this involves some degree of receiving all of your cards at the event itself and building a deck on the spot. Now, if you're playing sealed, like in a pre-release, you'll get a kit like this that has 6 booster packs inside, which means you're going to be starting with about 90 cards that you could potentially build your deck from. If you were playing in a draft format, you only have 45 cards, but you have a little bit more of a say in which cards you're starting with, so you can restrict yourself by color. But now if you're building a 40 card deck, usually you want to have about 23 or 24 playable cards and fill up the rest with land. So out of these 90 cards, we're only going to be taking a little bit less than a quarter. And that's nice because it gives us a lot of flexibility with what we're putting in. But there's a tendency to, even after you've selected your colors and decided on the mechanics that you want to include, you have a few extras left over. And so the way that I normally set this up is separating out the colors that I want to play as, and I do that first. I look at the card pool, decide which colors are strongest. In the avatar set, because there is a cedar pack aligned with the specific character and the specific color of the deck box that you get, usually that's going to be one of your colors. And then you can pick one of the other ones that has the strongest set of playable rares and uncommons. Sometimes you'll have a big bomb card that you really want to include, and that can speak to the colors that you pick as well. But once you do that, separate out the other cards and don't even look at them. They go in the sideboard, and even between games, you're not really going to bring those in. So we don't need to worry about it. They are out of mind. We've cut our pool in half. Now, building out the deck, we want to arrange this all by mana cost. And we start counting at that point. Figure out how many cards we need to drop, and at the point where we're counting like this, we might pull out a few of those cards that might not hold the power that we are looking for in our deck. Leaves us with a good selection of cards remaining, but we really do want to get down to 40 or sometimes 41 cards. And so when we're doing that, we have to make some hard calls. And sometimes that just comes down to mana cost. You have 3 CMC 6 cards in your deck, probably going to want to cut that down to 1 or 2. It's not a fast format in Limited, sometimes it is, but generally you have a little bit of breathing room, so your focus should be on your CMC 3 and 4 cards. Those are the ones that are going to have the most impact on play, and those are the cards that are going to help you recover if you get behind. Make sure you have some good playable cards in those ranges, and anything that is a more or less do-nothing card or only does something when you are already ahead, those are easy cuts. But now the cool thing about Limited is in between games, we have the opportunity to sideboard some stuff in. So I'd encourage you to, when you separate out the cards that you're not going to run in your deck, leave them organized by archetype or by use. If you're up against a really low-to-the-ground aggro strategy, bring in a few of those cards that can deal with that. If you're against something that's a little bit slower, a little more grindy, maybe swap out some of those low CMC things for some of those 6 mana cost bombs that you dropped earlier. I think that there's a lot of flexibility in Limited, and when you're building a 40-card deck, realistically, you don't need to think too hard about it. You have the opportunity to make some of those changes later, and generally, if you're playing in a pre-release, the stakes are pretty low. I find pre-releases a ton of fun, and I love just messing around and building some of the weird stuff. I leaned into 5-color allies in the last pre-release that I went to. I actually started with the Toph deck, and I did all right. I ended up going 3 and 2 in the event, and it was a good time. But you can do the weird thing. And honestly, I think that's one of my favorite things about building a limited deck like this. Whether it's a draft or a sealed tournament, you can try out some new things and be a little bit flexible with which cards you're picking. And if they don't go the way you want, well, you can always build something different next time, because you'll have a different pool of cards and you'll have a lot of different options to choose from. The best way to get better at Limited is to play more Limited. If you do enjoy drafting, seek out more opportunities to draft. A lot of people have cubes. See if you can arrange a cube day to just hang out, draft some of these cards, and experience some of this Limited format to get the hang of which cards you need to pick when in order to get the cards that you need for the deck you're building later. Making those cuts shouldn't be too hard because you already know which playables you've drafted. And in Sealed, by separating out some of those real haymaker cards from some of the other stuff that you're not so interested in, you can set a hierarchy of priorities of which cards need to go in the deck and which cards are filler. Then, when you lay out your mana cost, you simply slot in whichever filler cards you need to build that curve and have a playable range from CMC 1 to CMC 4 or 5. Anything else above that is going to basically be a dead card for the majority of the draft, so only include it if it really does close out the game. Moving on from Limited, I think we should take a look at Constructed, because it's a bit of a different experience when we can pick each and every card that goes in our deck. And we can be really particular and really specific about how we fill this list. So there's one thing about building Constructed that I don't see people talk about very much, and it's all of the different levers that you have to pull in these different formats. You have a limited card pool, and occasionally you'll have a ban list that you have to work around, but the reality is each card you want to throw in this deck can be run at 4 of a kind. So if you're looking for something really streamlined that really does the same thing every time it plays, you only need to pick 9 cards, 24 lands, 36 non-lands, and you're ready to go. We'll ignore sideboard for the purpose of this conversation, but usually your sideboard will be very meta-dependent, and you'll have to look up what other people in your area are playing and what other decks are hot right now, and put some of those answers into that extra 15 cards. But for the core 60, we don't have to actually pick that many cards, especially if we're looking at cards that overlap in mechanics. If we're running a few cards that do broadly the same thing, it's a little like we've only picked 5 cards, and one of those cards we're running at 12 of a kind. But if we do find ourselves a little bit over 60 and we want to do something a little more flexible, there's other levers you can pull. You can reduce the number of some of these cards that we're running in our deck. And so if you want to fit a 10th card, 11th card, maybe run a few of them at 2 of a kind or 3 of a kind. You see, there's an old rule of thumb that I used to hear a lot, and I don't think I've seen recently. But if you are building a 60 card deck and you have a card that you want to see in your opening hand as often as possible, you run it at 4 of a kind. Now, if there's a card that you want to see every single game, but not necessarily in your opening hand, you just need to draw it soon, run it at 3 of a kind. And if there's a card that is sometimes useful, but usually will only become relevant in specific situations, and you're going to eventually need to get to it, but not in any big hurry, you can run it at 2. Cards that you're running at 1 need to be cards that you can search for, or cards that are only relevant if the game grinds to a halt and you need a way to break the stalemate. Generally, running cards at 1 of a kind in a 60 card deck is a fool's errand. So try to stick to that 2, 3, 4 metric based on how often and how many copies you would like to see of that card in the course of an average game, and start working from there. Those last few cuts getting down to 60 can usually be made from those 3 of a kind copies to 2 of a kind copies. And occasionally you can cut into your lands, but I'd be very careful with that unless you have a lot of time to play test. Because anytime you start eating into that mana base, you dramatically increase the opportunity for you to not draw what you need and lose the game due to random chance. But if we're moving on from 60 cards and we're going to 100, that means it's time to talk about Commander. And while I really enjoy Commander, I think the fact that Commander explicitly states that you need exactly 100 cards can make deck building kind of stressful for people, and I don't think it should be. So let's talk about how to cut those last few cards without feeling the pressure or stress of losing some of our favorite cards in the process. Now we come to Commander. And this is the reason I wanted to make this video today, because I've just come into a bunch of Avatar cards. And while it's a set that is interesting to me, I didn't think I would be so excited about building a bunch of Commander decks from the Legends in this set. It turns out I was wrong, and I actually have a selection of cards that I really want to build a deck around. The first is kind of a jokey bracket 2 deck, and I really want to build Hey Bye, the Bear Spirit, because this is the least bear card in Magic. Typically when we say bear, we're referring to some sort of 2-power, 2-mana cost creature with an ability, or traditionally without an ability in green for the original Grizzly Bears. But this is a 4-mana, 3/3 with an ability in white and black, and it just happens to be a bear. But this looks like a really cool Voltron commander, and you can roll in some of these extra sacrifice mechanics to make this very beefy very quickly. I plan on running it with a bunch of equipment synergies and other on-attack trigger value cards, and I call this deck the Right to Bear Arms. The second deck that I want to build is Wan Shi Tung, which is the librarian from one of my favorite episodes in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and this is basically going to go in my mono blue control deck as a replacement for my Vinwixa with it. While I really do like the attack-centered nature of that card and the deck in general, it hits the speed 4 a little too late to actually get those extra draws, and I believe this commander does a little bit better job of dropping on turn 2 and accruing value over the course of the game. Additionally, if you are looking to play this in competitive, I think it goes into literally every blue deck. This card's insane. The third commander that I really want to build is Iroh Tea Master, and this is going to be kind of centered on those neutral, balanced cards that we can give to our opponent without giving them any additional value. These are your Blood Moons or Null Rods, some of these cards that affect the board no matter where they sit, and so you can build up an army pretty quickly. But the goal of Iroh is to give away poison while building an army, which seems very much in flavor with old Iroh. And finally, I really want to build Firelord Zuko. This is probably the second most interesting firebending card that I saw released in the set. The first is Ozai, but I think Ashley really wants to build him, so I'm going to stick to Firelord Zuko, and I think there's some really interesting things you can do with casting from exile. Lots of cool adventure cards and other things that can make this a really powerful, aggressive deck that holds on to that value really well. So let's talk about my process for building a commander deck. And I've set a few things on the table here. when I start building a commander deck, I have a few boxes that I immediately go to. The first is my big box of legends. This tends to have a lot of really interesting high-powered cards that go in a lot of different decks. Most of the time, these are also cards that came out of old commander decks and needed to be cut for one reason or another. If we need to go deeper than that, or if we are looking for a specific mechanic, I have a big rack of these boxes, each one with about 4,000 cards in it. And it'll take a little while to go through that, but that's got most of my uncommons and common cards. I have a few of the big BCW ones as well. So sifting through those, looking for interesting mechanics, going through my binders, finding some of the powerful rare cards, and if I'm looking to build competitively, I also have a couple boxes of proxies that are not currently in use. After I'm done with that, I probably have a pile of cards that looks a little something like this. About 120 cards in various states of removed from other decks, and now we get to the hard decision, and that's why we're here today. After we build our deck, after we pick the cards that we want to use, we need to make this fit in that 100 card limit. And after we add lands, we're about half the way over. So how do we make those cuts? Well, my first step is by going back to the mechanics. Do some direct comparisons, decide where we need a lot of activity on specific parts of the game. For Hey Bye, we are looking at the combat step. So we want to pull out as many cards as we can that really benefit that combat aspect of this card. If we're running a lot of equipment, and I think you can go either way between equipment or aristocrats, you can do a good job of building that specific style of deck in the cards that you set aside. And by the time you've done that, you've probably cut a good deal of cards off this stack. But the last cuts are always the hardest. So my recommendation to you is if you are building for Commander and you are trying to build out a new Commander deck and you've already gone through the cards that are sitting in front of you or gone through the digital list on something like Moxfield in which you've built it entirely virtually before going shopping for the cards that you need, I'd suggest that you don't bother making the cuts. Put those into considering, set those into the same deck box, and play the game a bunch. You can look at your mana curve and figure out exactly where you have big peaks and valleys and maybe remove some of the high CMC stuff, or maybe bolster some of the middle CMC stuff that was a little bit lacking to get that smooth curve up through CMC 1 through 5. But once you've done that, once you have that in place, just grab a couple cards that are on the fence for you and just pull them out of the deck. Set them aside, have a nice little sideboard that you can tinker with as you play the deck over time. You might find out that you don't really need as many treasure generators as you've thrown into that deck. You might find that with Firebending on Firelord Zuko, you need a way to spend that mana at instant speed. As you experience the deck in real time, you'll start to see some of those gaps. And then you can start swapping cards out. After a couple games, if you find a card is always a little bit disappointing when you draw it on turn 4, it might be time for that card to go. And I don't mean go into the sideboard and swap with another card. I mean that card goes back in this box, ready for another deck that might be able to use it a little bit better, and a card from your sideboard or considering pile can be moved in. As you iterate on this, you'll find yourself reducing the number of cards you have floating in the ether. And as new sets are released and as new interesting cards show up, this gives you a really nice process for just dropping those new cards into these deck boxes. Because over time, the meta shifts. Rest in Peace might not be so good in your local meta after people have moved off of playing all the graveyard stuff they used to be playing. So out it goes into the box for a deck that might care about that graveyard exile. And you can bring in a new card from the new set that looked interesting and you weren't sure if it would work. After a couple of games, maybe that new card wasn't cutting it, and so that one also goes into the box. By having this process of removing cards from your deck, you don't have to make those cuts right away. You can make those cuts over time. And I also think this becomes a really fun exercise in evaluating cards based on the decks that you already have. Yawgmoth's Will is a card that I really enjoy. I think it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of decks where it works really well. But every deck I put it in, It hurts me as often as it helps me, and it always ends up being in the first couple rounds of getting removed. If you have a deck that Yawgmoth's Will really shines in, please let me know, because I'm looking for a good home, and I don't think it really belongs in either Firelord Zuko or Hey Bye. But that would generally be my advice to you for making those last few cuts and getting that deck down to those deck limits. And I don't think this should be a stressful experience. I think this should be a process of discovery. We should see this as an opportunity so that when we are playing the games, we can evaluate our cards live while they are in process of being played. It helps us pay attention to the games that we are playing and do a better job of identifying weaknesses in our own gameplay styles and our own deck constructions. If we consistently find that we are short on mana, we might need to find a way to rectify that. If we find that our curve is a little bit clunky and all of those 2 mana cost rocks are hurting our ability to play 3 mana cost cards without having a lot of wasted mana, well, maybe we can make some shifts in that. I think there's good ways of building decks blind, but I think it's more important that we learn how to build decks as we play them. And I know there's a lot of people out there that don't actually enjoy deck building all that much. They'd much rather head to something like EDH Rec, set the commander, set a few requirements for what type of mechanics or what cards should be included in the deck, and then just click the big button for Generate Average List. Print that out, proxy it up, buy the stuff over time, and move on with their life. As new stuff comes out, they swap it in and out one for one, and they never have to worry about having to make those hard cuts. But that's not me, and that's not how I build decks. And so if you have your own strategy, or you have your own method for cutting decks down or building up to get exactly to that 100 card limit, I'd love to hear about it. So let me know, and I'll talk to you soon.